who's trying to hack into financial aid, security system.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get started by looking at, I don't like when it does this to me. Okay, we're looking at the concept of anatomy and physiology. So you do need to understand that they are kind of paired or twins, I guess. Whenever you study anatomy, you need to follow that with physiology. Many campuses that I have taught over the years, they teach that as one single course, so you will have anatomy and physiology. Your campus teaches those as a separate concept. But basically, the easiest way of looking at anatomy and physiology is anatomy is looking at the structures of the human body. So basically, when you do this, you're learning a lot of terminology. And I think a lot of you guys already know this, that when you hear the word anatomy, you kind of think about memorization. I'm going to get a bunch of words and I'm going to need to know those words. So for instance, if you're looking at your heart, I always give the example of the heart. If I'm doing the study of the anatomy for the heart, I would say, okay, here is the heart. My heart has four chambers or four cavities. The top ones are called atria, the bottom one are called ventricles. You know, you have blood vessels that are coming in or getting out of your heart. They're called arteries and veins, and then I'll go into more detail about the names for each of those. That's anatomy. Another aspect of anatomy that's not listed here is when we compare or look at the location of these structures within our body. And this is part of our lecture for today. For instance, I can say the heart is located inside my thoracic or thorax, or thoracic cavity. Basically, I'm telling you where it is located. I can tell you that my heart is located medial to my lung, which means that basically my heart is sitting in the middle of my two lungs. So when you think about anatomy, you're going to think about a lot about a structure and where it's located. On the other hand, when we think about physiology, physiology is all about how things work, so function. So when I talk about physiology of the heart, I already assume that you know the heart has the following chambers. The goal of physiology is to say, how does your heart pump blood? How does your heart create electrical impulses? How does your heart create blood pressure? So these concepts of how, anytime you put the word how, or when you think about function, what they're actually doing, that's physiology. But again, you cannot have physiology without anatomy. You can't keep saying that, you know, that top thingy on the heart pushes blood to the bottom thingy on the heart, right? So you have to have the proper terminology when you learn about physiology. So that's what usually you start with anatomy and then you work your way to physiology. By the way, before I forget, guys, if you do have questions, you're welcome to type those questions in the chat box and I'll get to them as we go over the concept, or you can hold them at the end when I open it up for the questions. But that's the easiest way for me to track them right now. Now, when we're talking about anatomy again, there are different versions of anatomy. So the common ones that we have are gross anatomy, surface anatomy, regional, systematic, microscopic, and comparative. So gross anatomy, anytime you hear the word gross, it's basically gross people out because it's something you see. It's also known as macroscopic. The word macro, what does that mean to you guys? Can you type it in a chat box when you hear macroscopic? Yes, macroscopic means big. So anytime you hear the word macroscopic, we're talking about something that is large enough that's going to be visible with the naked eye. So for instance, when I do dissection, right? Typically we do dissection of a cat in an anatomy class, or a fetal pig dissection. So you can take out the heart, you can take out the kidneys, you can take out the lungs and take a look at them. Look at their characteristics by making those organs basically right in front of you and provide characteristics for them. Opposite of macroscopic, opposite of gross anatomy is microscopic. So as the word microscopic implies, you automatically should think about microscopes, right? Which means something that is super small that can be only visible under the microscope. So that's microscopic anatomy, which is basically analysis of things like tissues, like cells, things that are, again, not visible with the naked eye. The other one that we have, which we don't really use in this class at all, is surface anatomy, which is basically, as the name implies, a lot of them are self-explanatory. What you're doing is basically looking at the external structures of the body. For instance, if you're doing surface anatomy for humans, you would be looking at your skin, your nail, your hair, your eye structure, an external aspect, your mouth, your nose, etc. It's not a very common anatomy or approach to anatomy, but it is something that's available. The other two that is, depending on the school, the approach might be different, is systemic versus regional. So when you hear the word systemic, you're thinking about organ systems. So just to kind of give you an idea, some of the organ systems we have are, and you probably have heard of these, cardiovascular system, nervous system, a skeletal system, muscular system, urinary system, digestive system. So when you do systemic anatomy, this is how you want to approach it. Today, we're going to talk about cardiovascular system. So I'm going to learn about all the organs that are associated with the cardiovascular system. Okay, so we discuss them regardless of where they are in the body. So you have heart and you have blood vessel basically that goes to every part of your body. I'm not looking at a specific part of the body. I'm just looking at the organ system in overall portion of your body, or all over your body. On the other hand, if I'm looking at the regional anatomy, when you hear the word region, what are you thinking about? Sections, right? So let's say I take my head, okay? So in my head, what I have is my brain, which is part of my nervous system. I have my mouth, which is part of my digestive system. I have my nose, which is part of my respiratory system. And then I have my skin, which is part of the integumentary system. Underneath that, I have muscles and I have a skeletal system, right? So you have many systems in a region of your body. So this regional anatomy study is what you usually do if you're in a med school. So basically they give you an arm and they say, learn everything about this arm, okay? Learn about the blood vessels, the nerves, the muscles, the bone, etc. We don't approach it that way. Our approach for our class is systemic anatomy. So for instance, again, one day we're gonna spend on cardiovascular, another day on respiratory, another on urinary system. So we study by systems rather than regions. And then the last thing that we have is comparative anatomy, which is basically you compare different species and kind of looking for these general characteristics that might be similar from one organism to another. For instance, again, earlier I was talking about dissection, right? And I mentioned the dissection of fetal pig and cat dissection, right? So those are comparative anatomy. Taking what I would see in my body or in a cadaver and compare it to another organism. Is there any questions so far, guys, before we move on? Awesome. Okay. And please use the chat box. So if I do ask a question, instead of unmuting yourself, again, just type your answer in the chat box. It is a good way for you guys to participate in a class without being too distracting and affecting our recording. Okay, so the next thing we're going to talk about is organizational level. So why do I even talk about this? Is because when we want to approach anatomy, we need to start from somewhere. So the way we look at it is we say, okay, as an organism, which is me as a human being, I need to figure out what I'm made up of. Basically, think about anatomy, right? Structures, what I'm made up of. So at the most complex level, the most complex organizational level that I have, that basically functioning, think about I'm functioning, right? I'm working, I'm alive. At the most complex level, I have an organismal level, which is basically me as a human again. So as a human, what I'm made up of is I'm made up of 11 organ systems. So if I break myself open, I do a dissection, what I will be actually made up of, and a kind of a simpler level of an organism would be organ systems. So as a human, again, we're made up of 11 organ systems. I'm going to briefly walk you guys through that. So organ systems are basically collection of organs with a shared function. So let's look at this. So sorry, my Alexa decided to talk by itself. I don't know if you guys can hear it. So it's just funny. It's like the house is completely quiet and all of a sudden it starts talking. So give me a function for digestive system. What is an organ's, the shared purpose of the digestive system?
Breaking down.
Your answer. Sorry.
Breaking the food.
Okay, breaking down your food. Okay. Again, please type your answers.
Oh.
What else, guys? What is other than breaking down your food? Which is basically breakdown is digestion, if you want to kind of think about it. Absorbing nutrients, that's a big one, correct. So you're not only going to break down your food, you need to bring it into your bloodstream, right? So mechanical digestion, correct. A lot of people, I think, forget that when you eat your food, you then need to bring it in because, and I'm going to gross you out. If you kind of think about your digestive system, it starts with your mouth, ends with your anus, right? So basically eating and pooping, right? I have a toddler, so none of these matters to me anymore. But why am I saying this? Is because if you just digest your food, it's still in your digestive system. And if you don't bring that food, that digestive or processed nutrient that you have mentioned, those processed nutrients into your bloodstream, you're just going to poop it out, right? So the digestive system has two main purposes. I'm going to take a look at this again. Versus digestion of your food, and then bringing those digestive processes or digestive food into your system or into your bloodstream. Now let's look at another one. What is the main function of your urinary system? Anybody knows that? Type it in your chat box. Okay, so elimination of the waste, correct. So what waste are we talking about, guys? Anybody have an idea? So waste is also, think about, pooping is also waste, right? So digestive system has waste. Not nutrients, actually. You don't get rid of nutrients in your pee. Sorry, I'm gonna be like really crude in these terms. Toxin is a big one. Uric acid is a big one. I'm assuming when you say chemicals, chemicals are like sodium, potassium, calcium, chloride. Toxins, when we're talking about them, we're talking about like medication, right? So again, kind of think about drug tests, right? What is a drug test? You pee in a cup and they test to see if you have drugs. Drugs are toxins, so you remove them. What if you drink a lot of water? What does your body do? You get rid of that extra water, right? Through urination, right? So it also helps you balance your water. So hopefully you get the idea that each of your organ systems have a shared function, right? Basically you work together, that system works together to accomplish certain tasks. So what is organ systems made up of? Organ system is made up of organs, right? The organ systems are made up of organs. So what are the organs that are associated with your digestive system? List them in your chat box for me. Just a couple of them, a few of them. Okay, stomach is a big one. Come on, other than stomach, what do we have? Esophagus, which is the tube that goes down your throat, right? Intestines, large and small intestine. Kidneys is actually part of your urinary system, right? Pancreas is a good one. Liver is a good one. These are accessory organs, but yes, they're still considered part of digestive system. Good job. Your mouth, your teeth, your gallbladder. A spleen is actually part of your lymphatic system. We'll talk about that. So great job. So what if I say, what is part of your urinary system? Rectum is also part of it, colon and rectum, yeah. So urinary system, you have your bladder, you have your kidneys. Do you know the tube that you pee out of? Anybody knows what that's called? So penis is really general, so it's more reproductive system. Urethra is the tube that you basically pee out, correct? What else? What is the one that collects urine from your kidneys and transfer it to your bladder? Anybody knows that one? It also starts with a U, but it's not urethra. It's ureter, correct, you got it. So ureter is the other organ that you have. So kidney system is, sorry, not kidney system. Urinary system is pretty basic, but it has 4 organs, but it does major job. Hopefully you guys fall into the track that what I mean by this. So you have organ systems, and each of those organ systems are made up of organs. Now, what is your organs made up of? Again, go back. They're made up of tissues. So tissues are basically collections of cells, and these collections of cells have a common function. So we just to kind of clarify, I'm going to go to the next slide. You only have 4 major type of tissues, and these are muscular, nervous, epithelial, and connective. And we will have a full lecture on this later on, but for now, all you need to know is they're tissues, which are basically, again, combination of cells, and there are 4 major type of tissues that we have in our body. Now, again, working backward, what are tissues made up of? Tissues are made up of cells, right? So cells are basically the smallest unit of a living organism. A lot of my students miss this, but easily when you think about cell, just think about basically any cell that you have in your body, like your skin cell, an eye cell, a nerve cell, a brain cell, a heart cell. You know, basically every organ that you have, they're made up of a cell, basically. Somatic cells is correct, it's just very general. So somatic cells is basically every cell you have, correct, every cell you have in your body, with the exception of the egg and the sperm, depending on the genetics, you will consider those somatic cells, correct. But when you write somatic cells, again, you're more talking about the genetic aspect or molecular aspect. We're talking about here in terms of anatomy. So you are better listing things like red blood cells, skin cells, bone cells, muscle cells, etc. Now, at the most basic level of us as organisms, we have what we call chemical levels. And chemical levels are basically collections of atoms and molecules. So I gave you examples of atoms here. Atoms are things like carbon, oxygen, hydrogen. If I ask you where you can find these names, what's the most common place you can find these names? Think about chemistry. Periodic table, correct. So things like carbon, oxygen, hydrogen, I don't know, nitrogen, chloride, potassium, sodium, things like that. Everything that you find in a periodic table will be identified as an atom. That's how we want to take a look at it. Now, if I take these atoms and combine them together, then you get what we call molecules. For instance, anybody knows what a molecule of water made up of? Okay, it is H2O. What is H2O exactly? Hydrogen and what? 2 hydrogen and oxygen, correct. So again, molecules are a combination of multiple atoms, oxygen and hydrogen. When you say carbon dioxide, for instance, it's made up of carbon and 2 oxygen. So when I ask you, and I think this is one of your Canvas post questions, so be careful, guys. If you are asking chemical level, you cannot just say atoms, or you cannot just say molecules. You have to say chemical levels is made up of both atoms as well as molecules, and make sure you can provide examples for both atoms and molecules. So don't eliminate one just because you talked about one, the other one. This is really common things for your exam, guys. So one of the things you really need to know, and I kind of want to kind of start hinting of what you need to study or how you want to study. First of all, be able to recreate this chart. So if I say list the organizational level from the least complex to the most complex, you go from 1 through 6. And if I ask you to go from most complex to least complex, you go from organismal back to the chemical. Be able to provide brief description as I have here, and then make sure you guys have a continuous, yeah, that's your Canvas post one, and you have examples for each of the levels. With the exception of chemical, remember that you have to provide both examples for atoms and molecules. Okay, any question, guys? Here's a picture of what that looks like, guys. So again, atoms and molecules for chemical level. For cell level, they have organelles. I'll talk about that later on, but we're just gonna focus on cells. Cells form your tissue. Tissue makes your organ, like a blood vessel. Organ forms your organ system, and organ system makes your full organism. Okay, guys, so we already at 9:25. So what I wanna do is actually take a moment, give you about 15-minute break, because we usually, this is a stop point for me, because I know brain kind of start to slow down soon. So I'd rather give you guys a break till, what time is it right now? 9:20, so until 9:35. You guys don't need to log in or do anything special. Just walk away from your computer and make sure you're back by 9:35, and then we'll just basically pick up from where we stop. But you don't need to stand behind your computer. Okay, so let's go ahead and continue with our PowerPoint. Okay, so when we talk about organ system, guys, so as I mentioned, we have 11 organ systems, which is basically going to be the focus of our lecture for the rest of the semester. But for today, we're going to just kind of briefly go over these, look at some of the main organs within each of these organ systems, and then some of the main functions that are associated with each system. So let's start. Some of this may sound unfamiliar to you guys, or you may have heard of all 11 of them. So we have integumentary system to start with. So integumentary system, as the picture shows, include your hair, your skin, your nails, and then what else? Your sweat glands, your oil glands, etc., which is not listed here. The main job of your skin or your integumentary system is to protect your body surfaces. It also basically acts as a protective layer from preventing things like pathogen, bacteria, viruses to get access to your internal organs. It also helps you synthesize vitamin D. You may have heard of it when they say, you need sunlight because sunlight helps convert cholesterol to vitamin D. And again, as I said, it helps you produce sweat and oil, which is responsible for basically cooling you down. Sweat is responsible for cooling you down. And then oil is also produces like antimicrobial components that not only kind of protect your skin against pathogens like bacteria, but it also provides a smoother skin for you. So again, kind of like when you wash your hands a lot, that oil on the skin goes away and your hands feel super dry. Another system that we have is the skeletal system. So that's basically all the bones and all the joints and the cartilage that are found in your body. The most important thing it does is basically protects and supports your body organs and creates a framework for you. So when you think about protection, what comes to your mind, guys, when you think about protection of the skeletal system? Can you type in your answers? What does that mean to you? Rib cage protecting your heart and your lungs. That's a good one. Yeah, what else? Okay, but what is that protection of organ? What are the examples of a protection? So rib cage is a big one. What else? Okay, sternum is another one that protects it, right? Your skull is protecting against what? You're protecting your brain against basically force. Pelvic bone is a big one. Yeah, pelvic bone is the one that protects your reproductive organ. What is this one, guys? What is the one that runs on the back? What is that called? Starts with a V. A spine is the soft tissue that's inside of it. So vertebra, correct. Your vertebral column more specifically, because it's 31 vertebrae on top of each other. And inside of it, it's protects your spinal cord. So yes and no, because muscles are actually come on top. So the question is, can muscles protected by the skeleton? Technically, if you kind of think about it, muscles are attached on the surface of the bone, so they technically cannot be protected by the bone itself. So we're looking more at the internal organs. Okay. And next we have the skeletal muscle. So skeletal muscles that are basically, as I mentioned just right now, these are the ones that cover your bones. They're connected to the bone, hence the word is skeletal. They provide support. They protect your internal organs as well. I tell my students, don't laugh at me, but this is the example I use. You know, like when somebody wants to punch you in your gut, what is the reflex that you do? Well, unless you've never been in a fight and you just take the punch like me, but you flex your muscles, right? You tighten the muscles of your belly, right? So if someone is trying to punch your belly, you crunch, right? Correct, that's the right word. So basically what you're doing is you're hoping that those muscles, as they tighten and they contract, that's a correct word, they're basically going to protect your internal organs. Their protection is not going to be, of course, as good as your skeletal muscle, but it's still, there's some level of protection. And again, because these muscles are connected to your skeletal system, they're going to help you with your movement, right? So basically any controlled movement, any voluntary movement that we do are under the skeletal muscle control. The next one we have is your nervous system. So nervous system is a really big one, which, I mean, if you look at the function, is pretty simple. It says it controls and coordinates all body activities, but just in that function is basically, it means it's your, basically your control center, right? It does everything for your body. If you want to move, if you want to drink, if you want to breathe, if you want your heart to beat, if you want to think, if you want to walk, if you want to talk, all of these are under the control of your nervous system. So it includes your brain, which is the big boss. And then as you can see, your spinal cord, which we just mentioned earlier, and all the nerves that are spreading throughout your body. We go into a lot more detail when we talk about nervous system later on in the nervous system lecture. Cardiovascular system, we already kind of briefly went over this. It's basically made up of your heart and the blood vessels, which are typically depicted as red and blue arteries and veins. And their main goal is to act as your transport system. They transport nutrients like glucose is a big one, your protein, amino acids. They transfer those, and then you also have gases. What are the gases, guys, that we have in our system? Two main gases. Just learn them right now. Not nitrogen. Oxygen and carbon dioxide, right? CO2 and O2. These are your two main gases. O2 is your good gas, as I put that in quote, and then your carbon dioxide is your waste gas or your bad gas. And then waste products, which is something we mentioned earlier, things like uric acid, toxins, urea, etc. And then respiratory system is another system we have. Basically, you have your nose, pharynx, which is your throat, your larynx, which is your voice box, the tube that goes down your throat, trachea, and then your lungs, which is the main organ. The main goal of your respiratory system is to basically get rid of your waste gas, your CO2, and then bring in the oxygen into your system. So it's that the whole concept of changing gases, O2 for CO2, is called exchange of gases. Seems very simple, but extremely important for your survival. Digestive, we already talked about it in detail. We already looked at the organs. You guys list them beautifully, so thank you for that. Again, it's basically your mouth, esophagus, liver, gallbladder, your intestines, the small and large, your stomach, and then eventually rectum and anal canal and anus. As you can see, the two main functions is digestion, which is basically breakdown of your food, and then absorption of the nutrients, which is bringing those into your blood. The one that might not be very familiar to many people is the lymphatic system. Many people refer to as the lymphatic system as immune system, which is basically the same. Lymphatic system is typically a generalized word for it. You can include your bone marrow. If you have ever heard of people who have lymphoma or leukemia, they need a bone marrow transplant. That's basically what we're talking about. There's a tiny gland called thymus that sits right on top of your heart. A spleen, somebody mentioned this earlier as part of digestive system, but again, in reality, it's part of lymphatic system. And then all of these vessels and little nodules that you see, that are your lymph nodes. Believe it or not, you have 500 of these lymph nodes throughout your body, which is amazing. I always tell my students kind of like, you know how like when you go to the doctor and you say, you know, you have a problem, like you have sore throat, etc. And they do this with you, like they touch right here and then they go come down your neck. They tell you to raise your arm and they touch under your armpits. What they're actually looking for is to see if if any of your lymph nodes are swollen, because that means that your body is trying to fight off an infection. Immunity, right? Defense of your body. So as it mentioned here, lymphatic system is basically involved in immunity, and it's also complementing your cardiovascular system in terms of fluid balance. We're not going to touch up on this. I don't actually cover lymphatic system as part of our anatomy lectures because it is almost universally physiology rather than anatomy. So you probably won't hear lymphatic system again. Urinary system, we already also talked about that. So kidneys, ureters, bladder, and urethra. If you look at the urethra in this picture, it's a female. So the urethra is relatively short. It's about maybe 1 to 2 inches. Versus in male, because it passes through the length of the penis, it can be up to 8 to 10 inches. So the urethra in male is longer than female. So if it was depicted, you could have seen that difference. And then what is the main function? Removal or excretion of your waste, water balance, which we mentioned also. And the one that I didn't describe to you guys and probably have never heard of is acid and base balance. So basically making sure what we call a pH, blood pH stays consistent. I'll talk about this in your next week's lecture, so we'll come back to this. Another important system we have is endocrine system. So endocrine system is also function-wise, like the job they do is similar to your nervous system, control and coordination of body activities. But anybody knows what does your endocrine system uses to control and coordinate your body activity? Correct, hormones. So hormones is a big component in endocrine system. Hypothalamus, you mentioned hypothalamus. Hypothalamus is one that actually releases the hormones. It's part of the body, but it releases the hormone. So hormone imbalance is a big one, correct? So when you're looking at this, some of the organs of the endocrine system, pituitary gland is a big one, thyroid gland, thymus, adrenal gland, which are these little things on top of your kidneys, pancreas, the sex organs, ovaries and testicles or testes are also identified as both endocrine system and reproductive system. So you can mark them as both because they release hormones, but they're also involved in the reproductive system. And then last but not least is the reproductive organs or reproductive systems. So some of them are listed for both male and female. So for male, we have the external genitalia like penis, testes, scrotum, which is the skin around the testes, ductus deferens, and prostate gland. And for females, we have things like ovary, uterine tube, or uterine, or fallopian tube, some people may know it as, uterus, and vagina. And for women, we also have the mammary glands, which are basically the tissues that produce milk during childbearing years. And then what is the main function of the reproductive system? Of course, it's basically creating the next generation, right? So it does that by producing the sex cells, which are egg and a sperm, correct, which eventually leads to creation of the offspring. The other thing that they do, and it's briefly mentioned here, is that they produce sex cells. Sorry, not sex cells, sex hormones. Anybody knows what is hormone? Really easy one to remember. I think everybody knows it. Testosterone, correct. And for women, there are two of them. There are estrogen and starts with a P. Progesterone, correct. So estrogen and progesterone are your two main sex hormones for females. So other than testosterone, estrogen, and progesterone helping with production of the sex cells, they also develop secondary sex characteristics. So what does that mean? Things like muscle mass for male, hair, facial hair, or armpit hair or axillary hair. For women, it helps their voice to be more high-pitched, development of breast tissue, pubic hair, leaner bodies. All of these are based on the estrogen and progesterone. And again, you can see significant changes. I always tell my students, kind of more physiology, but you can see significant changes in a female body after menopause, which is basically when the body stops producing estrogen and progesterone at significant amount. That's fine data, or they know, I guess. But when that estrogen and progesterone level decreases, it causes significant change in the female body, including a stopping of the menstrual cycle, which again, more physiology than anatomy. Okay, so we gotta switch gears unless there is any questions about what we've described so far. Awesome. Well, if there is, please don't hesitate, just type your questions. And when you answer, guys, make sure your answers are sent to everybody. It makes it easy for everybody to kind of track the answers. And I forgot to mention this as well, because I keep remembering things, I apologize. Don't hesitate to answer, guys, because you're worried your answer is incorrect. Nobody's gonna remember your answer was incorrect. So type an answer. It's a good way of you guys, your brain to start working and making sure that you are involved in your learning process is an involved process, an interactive process. It helps your brain learn the concept a lot easier. So typing your answers, even if it's wrong, it's better than no participation. Okay. Okay, so let's move on. So we're going to talk about anatomical positions and anatomical terminology. Hence, we're teaching anatomy. So first of all, when we talk about anatomical position, this is the position that you can see this person in. So it is where your person is standing erect, facing the individual, facing you, with their eyes looking forward, their palms of the hands showing, and basically your toes pointing forward. This is known as anatomical position. So why do we care about this? When we want to talk about front and back, what we see here in this picture is considered front. So the palms of your hand, which is the most common mistake I hear, the palms of your hands are anterior, the back, this is the back of your hands, which is the posterior view. But a lot of people say, oh, well, when I'm typing, I can see this part, so this is my anterior. No, this is your posterior, this is the anterior. So why do we talk about the anatomical position? Is because we're looking at a mirror image of ourselves. So basically, if I'm looking at this person, this side would be their right side, and this is their left side. So it's a mirror image of us, right? So don't assume just because this is your right side, that's the right side of that person too. That's their left side. This comes very handy when you are learning about the position of the organs as well as the circulation of blood in the heart. And you'll learn about that later on. But again, remember, mirror image, which means this is the right side, this is the left side. Okay, here I'm not gonna talk about every single word you have here, but do you need to know them? The answer is yes. You're gonna hate me? The answer is yes. But here's the key. If you learn this, the concept of anatomy becomes a lot easier for you, because most of the words you guys are gonna hear, they come from these original words. For instance, I'm just gonna give you a couple of examples. This region, your arm, is referred to as the brachial region, okay? So in this region, you have muscles that are called biceps brachii and triceps brachii. So if you know this region is called brachial, right? Your arm is called brachial, learning the name of the muscles become easier because the muscles also use the same vocabulary. Another thing, if I'm using the word arteries and veins, you have arteries called brachial artery and arteries called brachial vein. So if you already have an understanding that the word brachial means arm, then you are in a good position to learn a lot of the other vocabulary you will learn the rest of the semester. Another example, axillary. Axillary means armpit. So when you're talking about blood vessels again, the region of the body, axillary means armpit. Nasal is pretty straightforward. Flashcards are a good idea. So the question says, do you recommend using flashcards on our own? It's a good idea. I personally, and this is my experience, I don't like flashcards because a lot of the students start using them and spending a lot of time making them than learning from them. So if you're one of those people that are gonna do like 20 different highlights on 10 different flashcards to learn 5 words, don't do it. It's a waste of time. But if you're more like using it for like rough things, like, okay, I just have the words in front and then things in the back, without all those color coding, that's going to take a lot of effort. Flashcards are a great idea. If you're going to put a lot of effort on it and not use that as a study material, then don't waste your time and effort on it. Hopefully that answers your question. So this is the anterior view or frontal view. And then the next image, you have the posterior view of the vocabulary for the posterior view. Again, this is kind of really good for you guys to fall into the habits of learning this now rather than later because it makes your job a lot easier. Okay, so anatomical terminology. So these are terminology that you learn in terms of positioning of the organs and the relationship to others. They usually come as a paired word, such as front and back, top and bottom, or superior, inferior, middle and lateral, or medial and lateral. So they come as paired words, which is what we're gonna take a look at right now. Just gonna show you guys on a picture. So the first 2 words that we have is superior versus inferior. If we're talking about it in terms of nervous system, we can also use the word cranial versus caudal. So superior means moving toward the head. Inferior means moving toward the legs or feet. Let me give you an example. So the sentence that you guys are gonna make is a relation between 2 structures. For instance, my eyes are superior to my nose, or my nose is inferior to my eyes, right? So I'm using the word inferior and superior to identify the location of these 2 structures. My head is superior to my neck. I know it sounds kind of like childish, but kind of put your mind at ease in terms of using the vocabulary. The other one that you're gonna use is the word anterior versus posterior. Anterior, another word for it is ventral versus posterior dorsal. Anterior means moving toward the front of the body. Posterior means moving toward the back of the body. Another example. Everybody knows where your breastbone is, right? Right here in the middle, protecting your heart. What's the actual name for it? What's the actual name for the breastbone? Sternum, right, correct. So we can say that your sternum is anterior to your heart. Sternum is anterior to your heart because it's in front of your heart. Or your heart is posterior to your sternum, right? Because it sits behind it. Next set of vocabulary we have is medial versus lateral. So medial automatically should think about middle, right? So draw a line in the middle of your body. If you're moving close to that line, that's medial. If you're moving away from that line, that's lateral. So think about your heart and your lungs. Your heart is in the middle compared to your lungs. So we say your heart is medial to your lungs, or your lungs are lateral to your heart. If you're thinking about your bladder versus your kidneys, right? Bladder sits in the middle, kidney sits on the side. So kidneys are lateral to your bladder, and your bladder is medial to your kidneys. Hopefully that makes sense as well. And again, guys, if you do have questions as I go through this, type them in the chat box, please. Next one, we have proximal versus distal. Proximal means close to a point of attachment or moving close to a point of attachment. Distal means moving away from a point of attachment. This is the one that's a little confusing to some people, so let me give you an example first. So, I don't know what's wrong with my eyes, I apologize. So let's say when I think about my arm, hopefully you guys can see me on the image. I have a point of attachment, which is my shoulder up here. I have a point of attachment, which is my elbow. I have a point of attachment, which is my wrist, and then where my fingers attach, okay? So 4 points of attachment. So let's say I want to compare the relationship of my wrist versus my fingers, okay? So the point of attachment that both wrist and my fingers share is my elbow, right? That's the point of attachment that both of these share. So when I'm looking at this, my wrist is closer to my elbow than my fingers are to my elbow. So my fingers are distal compared to my wrist, or my wrist is proximal to my fingers because wrist is closer to my point of attachment. So if I ask you guys, what is the relationship? Let me ask you this first. If I say, what is the shared point of attachment for my ankle and my knee? What's the point of attachment for my ankle and knee? I'll give you your hip, correct. So the point of attachment that both of these share is your hip, correct. So if I say, what's the relationship between my my knee versus my ankle? Knee is what to my ankle? Knee is blind to my, correct. Knee is proximal to my ankle, correct, you got it. Because knee is closer to my hip than my ankle is to my hip. Make sense, guys? Is this clear? Got it, awesome. So anytime you hear the word proximity means closer. If you're talking about distal, it means it's farther away from that. So if you're looking at, let's say, here is my heart, okay? And then you have blood vessels that are immediately to your heart. Those are proximal blood vessels. And if you have blood vessels that are, let's say, on your hands or on your feet, they're distal blood vessels because they're farthest away from your heart. So the word proximal and distal is basically means close versus far. Good? Okay. Awesome. Okay, again, switching gears. So we're just kind of like going over these general aspects of anatomy. Yes, for most things you're looking. So the question is, when you're asking a relationship, do we have to look at the point of attachment they share? Correct. So if you're looking at, let's say, going back to the example, if you're looking at your elbow and your wrist, you cannot use as elbow as your point of attachment, right? It needs to be a point of attachment that's shared with both of them, which is your shoulder or shoulder girdle. In terms of things that I gave you the example for heart, heart is the point of attachment for both of your blood vessels. We're just looking at which one is closest, which one versus which one is the farthest away from that. Anything else, guys? Any other question? So when we're talking about our body, guys, as we mentioned earlier, we said we have the front of the body and we have the back of the body, right? Frontal is also used the word, sorry, not frontal, anterior, I should say. We have anterior aspect of the body, which is also known as ventral. And we have the back of the body, which is basically posterior or dorsal. Now, both in front and in the back of our body, we have cavities. And these cavities are basically where our organs are going to be located in. So we have cavities that are in the front, and it's separated by our diaphragm. And I will just show you the picture. So what you see in the red is my ventral body cavities or the anterior body cavities. And so you see this line right here in the separation, that's your diaphragm, which is a large dome-shaped muscle. Anything above that, anything above the diaphragm is called thoracic cavity. Anything below that, in general, as a big thing, is called abdominal pelvic cavity. And honestly, guys, if you just look at the word in this case, for instance, it's pretty self-explanatory. When you see an abdominal pelvic, it means we're talking about what? Abdominal cavity and pelvic cavity, right? Pretty straightforward. So what is thoracic cavity made up of? So what is your chest cavity in layman's term made up of? Chest cavity is made up of superior mediastinum, which is this one right here. The one that has your heart called the pericardial cavity. And the one that your lungs belong to, so these two on the side, are called pleural cavity. So one more time, if I say, what is your thoracic cavity subcavities are, the subcavities are superior mediastinum, which includes, and I didn't mention that, so I'm going to mention it, includes things like your esophagus and your trachea, the tubes for the food and the tube for the air. Pleural cavities, there are two of them. That's where your lungs are located. And then pericardial cavity, which is where your heart is located. Now, if you go down to the abdominal pelvic cavity, which is the one down here, the abdominal cavity, can you guys tell me what is, yes, these are subcategories. So what is inside this category of, or subcavity of abdominal cavity? Can you guys tell me what is in your abdominal cavity? List the organs for me. Intestine's the big one, correct. It takes a lot of space. Not bladder, kidneys, liver, spleen, correct, you got it. So basically, if you look at the abdominal cavity, you have your liver, your stomach, this huge space would be your intestines, you have your gallbladder, etc. So basically, most of the organs we identify as our digestive system would be located in our abdominal cavity. Now, what do you think is located inside our pelvic cavity, guys? Two main things are located in there. Bladder is a big one, part of your part of your urinary system. And then sex organs, correct, which is ovaries, or in case of males would be the prostate glands and your accessory glands. So reproductive organs, we're just going to keep it general, located and protected by your pelvic bone and your pelvic cavity. Part of the rectum is also located in the pelvic cavity. Yes, you got it. So looking back, here is what I have for you guys. So it's already mentioned everything here. Thoracic cavity has 3 subclassifications: superior mediastinum, pleural, and pericardial, and it tells you exactly what it includes. And then abdominal pelvic cavities are abdominal and pelvic. And again, it tells you what is included in each of those. Does that make sense to everybody so far? For the ventral cavity, awesome. So what you see here in the image, that would be your dorsal cavity, right? Dorsal means posterior, in the back, right? So we have the what we call cranial cavity. Cranium comes from basically a skull. So inside the cranial cavity, you have your brain. And we already learned the proper word for the cavity inside this. It's called the vertebral cavity. It's not called the spinal cavity. Some people refer to it as a spinal cavity. But unless you've not taken anatomy, you may call it a spinal cavity. But as soon as you've taken anatomy, you have to use it the proper word, which is vertebral cavity, because it's inside the vertebra. And it contains your spinal cord, which is that yellow line you see going right at the center. So cranial cavity is simpler than your, the dorsal cavity is simpler than the ventral one. Again, it's really important, guys. Exam questions could be something like, which cavities is your heart belong to, okay? That would be, what subcategory does your heart belong to? Your heart. Okay, thoracic is the big one, but what is the small cavity that contains the heart? Pericardial cavity, correct. So again, pay attention to this, guys. Am I using the sub-classification or subcategories versus the big category? So your heart is part of the thoracic cavity, which is the big umbrella term. And then the smaller subcategory would be your pericardial cavity, correct? What if I say, where is your category, or what cavity does your reproductive organs belong to? Pelvic cavity, correct. And if I say what sub-classification would be, it still would be pelvic, right? So that's pelvic is the sub-classification, but if we're talking about the beginning, the big category would be abdominal pelvic, because it's the umbrella term. And you can see a different view here. I like this view for the ventral body cavities. You have the thoracic again, diaphragm separating it, abdominal cavity, and then the pelvic cavity. Okay. So let's take a look at the next thing we're going to talk about, which is serous membrane. And this is the one that some of my students get confused about. So let's take a few moments and look at some of the examples, and let's go through like kind of the back and forth questions that we have. So when we look at the organs that are located inside our thoracic cavity and abdominal pelvic cavity, so all of the organs that you just listed, like your heart, your lungs, the abdominal organs. For most of these organs, what you have is this double membrane that is wrapped around these organs. So you have the cavity, basically, the double membrane, and then the organ inside of that cavity. So one thing that you really need to know about this is that this double membrane is continuous, guys. So what do I mean? What do I mean by this? So, sorry, I'm just going to show you something. Don't laugh at me. I just literally came up with this idea. So here's my plastic bag, okay? So this plastic bag has 2 layers, right? That forms the front and back. So if I take my hand, and this is what I usually have a picture for. If I take my hand and kind of push it inside the plastic bag, right? Hopefully you guys can see this. Okay? Everybody sees this? Right? This beautiful demonstration I'm doing. Okay, so my hand is in direct contact with the plastic layer, right? As I'm pushing in, my hand is coming in direct contact with a layer of the plastic bag, right? Then there is a gap, right? This is the gap. And then there is an outer layer, which is this one that my organ is not coming into contact with. So I still have two layers, right? I didn't chop the little plastic bag to two pieces. I can make my screen bigger. It is my camera. So you can make your own screen bigger, but I can make your screen bigger. Right. So if I'm putting my hand, one layer is coming into contact with my organ, right? And then there is an outer layer that is not coming into contact with my organ. So this layer is the outer layer. Now again, there is a gap between these two layers, right? So this is the gap that I'm talking about. There is another gap in between these. So why am I talking about this like this? So the layer that is coming, this double layer, the layer that is coming into contact with my organ, okay? That's called the visceral layer. So if my hand, let's say it's my heart, the layer that is coming into contact with my heart is the visceral layer. This outer layer that is not coming into contact with my organ is one continuous layer, right? But it becomes two layers as it comes into contact with the organ. So the outer layer that is basically gonna line the cavity, the pericardial cavity, that's my parietal layer. Are they separated from each other? No, it's still one continuous layer. The difference is one is coming in direct contact with my organ. The other one is gonna be outside lining the cavity. Is this making sense to you guys? Okay, so let's take a look at the picture, and the picture does a good job, but now that you have that idea about the plastic bag, let's take a look. So here's your heart, right? It is the inner and outer layer, correct. So the inner lining, this lining, the red layer that is inside, that is directly in contact with the heart, that's the inner layer, and that's called visceral layer. The darker layer, that is this layer around, and it's basically coming into contact with the cavity that holds the heart, that's my parietal layer, okay? So inner layer, outer layer. Now, we're gonna associate this visceral and parietal to all the organs that have these layers around them. So let's take a look. Go back to our previous slide. If we're talking about, and I'll come back to the function in just a second. If we're talking about your lungs, the layer that covers it is called pleura. So the plastic bag, if I'm talking about the lung, it's called pleura. If I'm talking about the abdominal cavity, the plastic bag is called peritoneum. If I'm talking about the plastic bag around my heart, it's the pericardium. Make sense so far, guys? So depending on which organ it belongs to, we call them different names. Are they different? No, there is still the double membrane. There's still my plastic bag, but it depends which plastic bag we're talking about. Around the heart is pericardium. Around the organs of the digestive system or abdominal cavity is peritoneum. If it's around the lungs, it's pleura. So give me this answer. If I look at, yes, it depends. So it would literally depends on the organ. So pay attention and then give me an answer. If I'm looking at the outer lining of the abdominal cavity, what do I call that? Outer lining of the abdominal cavity. Type it in the chat box. Peritoneum is half the credit. Outer lining of the abdominal cavity. Give me the full name, guys. Parietal peritoneum, correct. A couple of you guys got it. So you cannot just say parietal. You cannot just say peritoneum, guys. You have to put them together. So look at the word I'm telling you, outer. So if you hear the word outer, you automatically should say what? Parietal, right? Because it's associated with the abdominal cavity, we say peritoneum. So let me ask you another one. What is the inner lining? that comes and covers the heart. Inner lining that covers the heart. Correct. Visceral pericardium. So visceral pericardium would be your name, not parietal, right? Visceral, right? Because it's the inner lining that comes in direct contact with the organ. What is the inner lining? You guys got it. What is the inner lining that covers the lungs? Visceral pleura, you guys got it. Good job, guys. So be specific, guys. Do not just tell me peritoneum, pericardium, or pleura. You have to put them together. You have to decide if you're using, so your options are basically, let me put it this way. The options are visceral and parietal. That's the first word that you need to include. And the second part of your vocabulary would be pleura, peritoneum, and pericardium. So it's a two-part name. You cannot just tell peritoneum. You have to say either it's visceral or parietal. Look at the example I gave you. Basically, I'm asking you, if it's coming into contact with the organ, directly in the organ, contact with the organ, that's the visceral. The outer lining, this one that's outside, that's the parietal. Now, what is the organ? What's my hand represents? If my hand's representing the heart, then I'm gonna use the word pericardium. If my organ are the abdominal organs, I'm gonna use the word peritoneum. And if it's my lungs, it would be pleura. Good? Logical? Questions? Yes. So you have to have two words. It's kind of like first name, last name. You don't just go like visceral, parietal. You have to use visceral, pleura, peritoneum, or pericardium. Awesome. You guys are just lucky there was a plastic bag on my table because I don't clean my house. Sure. Let's do, so they said, can you ask another question? So let's do, what is the layer? I'm going to make it tricky, guys. What is the layer that would be wrapped around my stomach? Sorry, that's my evil eye. It's a visceral stomach. Good try, though. Visceral peritoneum, correct. Because we know a stomach is where, guys? A stomach is part of the peritoneum, right? It's part of the abdominal cavity, so we're going to use the word peritoneum. But don't parietal, because I said it's coming into contact with the stomach, right? If it's coming into contact with the stomach, it would be visceral layer, right? If I say, what's the outer layer of the one that protects the stomach, then I would say parietal peritoneum. Then you would be right. Okay, moving on, guys. We're good? And this is basically the description that I just talked to you guys about. So visceral pleura, for instance, covers the lung. Parietal pleura lines the thoracic cavity. Visceral pericardium covers the heart, etc. And then you guys can read through this. One quick note, guys, in terms of the abdominal cavity, the organs that are found inside the abdominal cavity, there are organs that are technically not surrounded with this double membrane, and these are called retroperitoneal organs. These organs, again, they do not have that wrapping around them. It includes part of the intestines as well as your kidneys. They're not part of this serous membrane, so they do not belong to that. And then one last thing, we talked about this naming, right? But why do I need that double membrane anyway? Why do I need the serous membrane anyway? The main reason is basically they produce lubricating fluid. So basically when your organs move, so your heart, your heart beats, right, continuously, your lungs, every time you breathe, expand and decrease in size. When you eat, your intestines and the stomach, etc., move, right? So what happens is every time they move, they can rub against the organs that are next to them, and they can create friction. And we know from our life, day-to-day life, that friction is never good for something, right? Because it's gonna damage this. So what this serous membrane does, it creates this slimy surface on them. And that slimy surface or that lubricating surface is basically allow these organs to kind of slide over each other and limits the friction. Therefore limits the damage. Have you guys ever seen like when they open a cadaver or when they're doing like surgeries, when they open it up, it looks very slimy in there? Yeah, exactly, like an oil for the engine. So that sliminess that you see around the heart, your lungs, intestine especially, that's what it is. It's the serous membrane that is basically making sure there's lubrication for the organs. So again, it allows these organs to slide over each other with limited friction. I said without friction, there is friction, but it's going to be super small compared to when that fluid is absent. So I'm keeping an eye on the time. I want to make sure I don't go over. We have time, plenty of time. And then the other thing that's really cool, guys, is that it contains the infection to that local location. So for instance, let's say if you have an infection in one lung, you don't want that infection to start spreading to the heart and to the other lung, right? So it limits by having this kind of plastic bag around that organ, it limits it to that organ. It doesn't allow it, the rest of the body to become septic to that. So that's also a really good characteristic to have. Is there any questions before we kind of switch gears again? No, we're good? Okay. Awesome. So this part, I'm gonna look at what we call sections or body planes. This is basically what we have in terms of if you're going into like things like radiology or ultrasound. This is what you guys actually want to learn a lot and know a lot about. These are the planes of the body. There's 3 planes, and I just kind of want to demonstrate for you on myself before showing you the picture. So the way I can cut the body, quote unquote, is by cutting it like this. So if I cut like this type of cut, it's called the sagittal plane. So what I'm gonna get is basically I'm gonna get the right side of the body and the left side of the body, right? The other way you can think of it is I can get what we call medial and lateral, right? So if I'm cutting like this, if I'm close to the point of cut, that's the medial. And if I'm moving away from that, that's my lateral. So it breaks your body basically both to the right and left, as well as medial and lateral. The other way I can cut me, not cut me, but you know what I mean. I can cut like this, right? So what I would see in this type of cut, which is called transverse plane, is I'm gonna have a top portion and a bottom portion, right? Or a superior and an inferior. Most of, if you guys, when we go to the histology lab, which is basically looking at tissues of the body, most of the cuts that you guys gonna see are in a transverse plane, which means they cut the tissue like this across, like cut an apple across, right? And then you look at it from either the superior view or the inferior view. And again, if I cut like this, you get superior and inferior. Last cut is cutting like this. So people don't confuse it with this. So this is sagittal, right? This is what we call coronal or frontal. So when I cut like this, I get the front and I get the back. So what is the proper word from the front and back, guys? We learned 2 sets of words for them. Anterior and posterior, which is also what? What's the second set? Other than anterior and posterior. Ventral and dorsal, correct, you got it. So ventral and dorsal is, ventral is anterior, dorsal means posterior. You guys got it, good job. So happy, I want to cry. I haven't done this type of class for a long time, so when you guys give me the right answer, I get emotional, sorry. Okay, so when you're doing, again, sagittal cut, you get left and right or medial, lateral. Transverse cut, you get superior, inferior, not really, but thank you. And then coronal cut, you get front and back, or anterior and posterior. Here's a picture of what this looks like, and when they do an image, what that image actually looks like. So here's your 3 cuts. Again, you can see this one, that's your sagittal cut. If it's right in the middle, called median or mid-sagittal. Dorsal is, sorry, I'm gonna quickly answer the question. Dorsal is posterior, ventral is anterior. So you can say ventral and anterior, or dorsal or posterior or back. Okay, so the 3 cuts again, you have median, which is mid-sagittal, transverse going across, and then frontal, which is front and back. So look at this cut, guys. So this is a transverse cut you see right here. So here is the front. This is basically your belly right here. This is your back. What you see here is your spinal cord. Here is your liver. That's your stomach. That's your spleen right here. So they're basically cutting you right underneath the diaphragm. Posterior means back or dorsal. So front, anterior, posterior, dorsal. And again, you can see your vertebra. Vertebra is not in the front, so it's a good way of figuring out where's your back and front. Look at this one, guys. It's a side view. So look, here, this looks like a snake to me, right? That's your vertebra. Do you see this one at the end? That's your tailbone, guys. Right here is your tailbone. So basically, if you have a tailbone, that's your butt. Well, not your butt, but somebody's butt. So here is the butt. Here's again the rectum. That means this is the belly region. And then basically this is the internal organs in the abdomen. No scoliosis. The scoliosis, you can't see it on this view. A scoliosis, if you guys have never heard of it, is when you guys have the vertebra shifting either to the left and right, and you won't be able to see it on this view. You have to be looking at it from the person from the front. So if you're looking at the front, you can see the curvature going like this. And this is me standing like this. So I'm going to get upside. So if I'm standing like this, the curvature of the spine is back and front, which is normal. So it's side to side versus back and front. Side to side, not good. That's a scoliosis. Back and front, good. That's because if you don't have that, you have severe back pain. You have major problems. Does that make sense? So this is a good curvature. This is a good curvature, unless it was side to side, then that was a bad curvature. Okay, and then, oops, sorry. And then this is the front view. So what you're seeing is the neck region on the top, the shoulders, right? And then the chest cavity. So you see the 2 lungs right here. Here is the heart right here. And yes, heart is not up here or here. Heart is in the middle of your chest. I like it when people say, you know, in the movies, I hate it when I get really pissed at the movies. The person gets shot here and it's like, oh my God, this person got shot in their heart. And I'm like, whose heart is up here? Like, I don't there's no heart up there. Heart is in the middle of the chest. Think about CPR, guys. When they give the CPR, they don't go up here to do CPR, right? They do in the middle of your chest. Anyway, sorry. It's just annoying sometimes when you see mistakes in the movies. Oh my God, they got shot in the heart. Anyway, so here's your diaphragm. This line is your diaphragm. And then here is this gigantic thing you see right here, guys. That's your liver. That's the liver up here. You can take a look at it. It's really large, guys. It's a pretty large organ. So the question is that yes and no, but when they're describing it, you don't actually have really big major arteries here. Your big arteries would be right here. So right on top of your esophagus and trachea is where you have your big arteries, which are your superior superior vena cava, your aorta, your pulmonary arteries. So the damage is to this region that's that really is scary, not to your lungs. If you get hit on the sides, usually you get a what we call a pneumothorax, which is a collapsed lung, not many major blood vessels. Unless you hit under the armpit, which is where you have all the blood vessels that are going to your arm, then you can have major bleeding. That's a different story. Almost over, guys. Just bear with me for a few more minutes and then we'll done with today's lecture. Okay, so when we're talking about the abdominal region, or more specifically abdominal pelvic region, we can break it to what we call quadrants. And everybody knows quadrants means what? So when you use the word quads, what does that mean? Four, correct. So four regions or four quadrants. So this is just going to use the word quadrants. And then when we use the word regions, which regions means 9 sections. It doesn't mean, regions doesn't mean 9, but in our case, when we use the word regions, it means we are dividing the abdominal region to 9 sections. So when we're looking at the quadrants, so here's a quadrant. So you take the abdominal pelvic, and you basically do this kind of arbitrary line on it. And then you have this one that is the right upper quadrant, or RUQ. That includes your liver, right? We learned about this big one is the liver. What is this one, guys? This little green thing here. Anybody? Not a spleen, gallbladder, correct. A spleen is on the other side. So your gallbladder, you have part of your stomach. Remember these guys for your lab today. We're gonna come back to Hanchi later. You have part of the large intestine, you have part of the small intestine. Left upper quadrant, which is this side. What is this again? What is this organ that I'm going over right now, guys? That's your stomach. And for those who may wanna know the spleen position, the spleen's right here, is this organ on the side. And then you have, again, part of the small and large intestine tucked in here. And then the 2 bottom ones are right and left lower quadrant. Anybody knows what this is? What this heart-shaped organ is? It's not actually your rectum, it's your bladder. It's urinary bladder. Rectum is right behind it. So if you're looking at this picture, do you see this part, guys? Right here, it goes behind the bladder, and that's basically when it does look like rectum. I mean, it looks like onion. Yeah, that's the rectum. So rectum is behind the bladder. Kind of remember your poop hole is in the back, your pee hole is in the front. I'm sorry, it's not very scientific sometimes. Anyways, anybody knows what this is? This little tiny thing hanging right here. Appendix. Good job, guys. So right lower quadrant. So you know, like when you have local pain on the right lower quadrant, the most common diagnosis is appendicitis, right? Appendicitis is basically when you have an inflammatory response because of viral or bacterial infection for the appendix. And if it's not treated, it can burst and it can cause the abdominal cavity to be sepsis, and it can lead to death. So if you have continuous lower, right lower quadrant pain, please make sure you go see a doctor. And the good chance is that it might be appendicitis. Okay, so the question is, when we gain weight, the stomach enlarge, right? Yes and no. So a stomach size change happens because of the food that you eat, or the amount of food that you eat. Over time, if you're consuming a higher level of food than usual, then the elasticity of the stomach, so that kind of like a stomach gets big, and then when it's empty, it gets small. You eat, gets big, when it's empty, it gets small. If you eat continuously, huge meals throughout the day, then the stomach continuously stays large, and it's kind of like an elastic band. So it just stays large. It doesn't go back, it doesn't shrink anymore. So does a lot of people who are overweight have a large stomach? The chances are yes. But the weight gain that you see, you learn about in digestive system later on, is because of the storage of fat in the lining of the stomach called the greater omentum. So basically that's where your fat gets stored. So if you look at all of these organs, so imagine like you're doing a dissection of a human, okay? When you open the abdominal cavity, you don't immediately see all of these organs. You actually, what we see is a layer of fat that drapes over the stomach. And that's basically where the fat storage is. So the chubbier you are, basically, the more fat you have in that. Yes and no, I don't want to call this the visceral fat because this is actually part of the, no, let's not use the word visceral fat. We're not going to get into this, but no, this is not the same thing as the visceral fat that you have under your skin. That's a different one. This is literally a layer of fat that is specific to the abdominal cavity. Hopefully I answered that. Is the appendix on top of the large intestine? No, actually, if you look at this, this is the start of the large intestine, this little blob that you see. It's a pouch called cecum, and that marks the beginning of your large intestine. And your appendix is directly connected to that, actually. So hopefully that answers your question for appendix. Michelle. Yeah, my layer was already there. Now I got a little one inside there too, so it's not becoming any smaller anytime soon. So I think many people have gained that layer. It's okay. Hopefully we'll be out of this pandemic sometime soon, and we can go back to a more normal life. We all hope for that, right? Okay. Yes, they did. Okay, so let's talk about the last concept I want to talk with you guys today, and I think that's it. Yeah, okay. I just want to make sure. So that's the regions, guys. So we talked about the regions being 9 sections. Again, something to remember for your lab today. You always can come back to the lecture PowerPoint and refer to this. So there are 9 regions, and they have very specific names. Make a note for yourself, guys. This picture will be in your exam, and I do expect you guys to know the region. So I would have like letters A, B, C, D, whatever, and I would say, what is this region? And you need to be able to name this region for me, okay? So get used to this picture as well. Okay, so what are these 9 regions called? First of all, to make it simple, guys, you don't need to learn 9 names, actually. You need to only learn 6 names. Because if you look at the names on the right-hand side and the farther left-hand side, the names are identical. It's just right versus left. So as far as you get the right and left correct in terms of anatomical location and positioning, then you're good. So right hypochondriac, left hypochondriac, right lumbar, left lumbar, right iliac or inguinal, and then left iliac. So let's break down the words for you. So I'm going to type them in the chat box so you guys can have that knowledge. I don't have my my instrument connected, so I can write directly on the PowerPoint. So write these words for yourself. It's going to help you guys understand the concept a little bit better. The image is mirrored, correct. So remember the anatomical position. And I just want to kind of quickly go back to this to make sure everybody's on the same page. So remember here when we talked about way back then, this position, right? So this is right, this is left, right? So right and left. Oh, so thank you for answering the question. I wasn't related to this, so I was going to go back to it later on, but thank you for answering that. So let's go here. So in the chat box, guys, I'm typing the answers so you guys can read the word. So the word hypo means below. The word hyper means above. So hypo and hyper are those terminology that kind of paired. So the word chondriac comes from chondro, which is, chondro implies cartilage. And I'll come back to this in just a second. The word lumbar means back. So anytime you hear the word lumbar pain, that means back pain. The word iliac is associated with the pelvic bone called ilium, which is, you know how, have you seen the pelvic bone, that big chunky piece on the top that kind of looks like an ear? That's the iliac bone. Epi, the word epi means on top of. Then we have the word gastric, which means the stomach. And I think that's it in terms of vocabulary. So I'll leave those in the chat box, but I need you guys to actually pay attention to what I'm saying if you guys are writing that separately for yourself. So here is what I want to talk about. So let's talk about the word hypochondriac. So hypo means below cartilage. Chondriac means cartilage. So right and left hypochondriac. So what they're referring to is, if you look at the rib cage, so you have the rib bones coming in, but these sections right here, and you can't see it very clearly, but see there's a separation line right here. So these regions you see right here, when I'm running my cursor on, these are actually cartilage. They're not bone. The bone is the actual rib, but the connection to the sternum is cartilage. So when you see these two regions, this one and this one, they're right below that cartilage region. So we call them literally what? Hypochondriac, as in below the cartilage. Does that make sense to everybody? So if I ask you hypochondriac, not really, okay, that was an honest answer. So what is the word hypo means? Tell me guys, what is hypo means? Below something, right? Chondriac means what? Cartilage, right? So here's your cartilage. So these two regions, one here and one here, it literally means what? Below the cartilage. Hypochondriac means below the cartilage. So what is the cartilage? These regions are the cartilage. So these two regions are right below it, this one and this one. So we call them literally, the name is below the cartilage in Latin. Does that make better sense now? Yeah, good. Okay, right and left lumbar. So again, easy. Lumbar means back. So we have the right lumbar, back, left lumbar. That's simple. This one, look at the location. So do you guys see this kind of a V shape that you see right here? Right here, this is one line, this is the other line. That's basically your pelvic bone. That's the line for the pelvic bone. So iliac, as I mentioned earlier, is the bone, the top portion of your hip. That kind of the ear portion of the thing. Okay. So right iliac basically means you're on the right side associated with that bone. And then the left iliac means basically you're located on the opposite side. If you guys are interested in the word inguinal, I don't necessarily want you guys to know this, but this is something you may see later on in the reproductive system. Yeah. You know, have you heard of the hernias? People, male especially, get hernias in that region. So basically what the word inguinal is these little openings in the membrane, in the serous membrane, where the intestines can come out into the pelvic region. And that can cause problems. So when you're using the word inguinal, they're talking about those two openings that are located in that region. If we want to know more. But the common terminology they use is iliac because the bone is a more common way of calling this. So we learned both right and left, right? Because the name on the right-hand side is the same thing on the left. So let's go in the middle. So epigastric, epi means above, right? On top of something. Gastric means a stomach. So if you look at this picture, most of the region is above the stomach. So this is called epigastric. The middle section is where your umbilical cord, when you were a baby in your mommy's belly, will be connected. So we call that the umbilical region. Really simple. I mean, like it can be simpler than that. And then hypogastric, it means basically below the stomach, right? So if this is your stomach, it's below the stomach. So it's called hypogastriac. It's also referred to as the pubic region because it's representing the reproductive organs in that region as well. So you can use both names, but you do need to know both names to be more comfortable with to answer the questions. So some of my students asked, and this is the last thing I want to talk about. Some of my students asked, why do we care about learning about the region and quadrants? So again, going back to what I was mentioning earlier, this has to do with people that do imaging, such as like CAT scans, CT scans, radiology, ultrasound, etc. So when a doctor wants a radiologist to take a picture, they don't say, take a picture of the stomach, right? So let's say the person has a localized pain on their top right-hand side of their abdominal cavity. So instead of the doctor says, take a picture of the liver, what they can say is focus on the right hypochondriac region, or they can also say, take images of the right upper quadrants of the body. So that's why these words are in existence. It also helps you identify the location of the organs. It also helps you when you do surgery. So these are all important in terms of using the proper terminology to localize where the pains are, where the images are, or when you want to actually perform surgery. So hopefully that makes sense. So that's it. That is our lecture for today. Is there any questions or concerns you guys have about what I've described to you guys? Anything about the lecture today? Good. The slides are under your module I showed you guys earlier. It's under module week 1. I'm not sure what you mean we can review on your own. No, you don't go to the lab. I'll talk to you guys. Just let's focus on what we talked about for lecture right now, and then I'll talk to you guys for the lab in just a minute. So let me do this. I'm gonna stop recording.